Beautiful. Welcome, welcome everybody. So take your time to get comfortable, get restful. Some of what we'll speak to today as I share a few stories and fairy tales from my upcoming book, Kitchen Witch, Food, Folklore and Fairy Tale. Some of these stories will feature the character of the witch in her or their many forms. Other stories might perhaps have been told by the wise woman, the kitchen witch, the healers. They might have spoken these tales around hearth fires to pass on information about food, fairies, or folk magic. So hopefully all that you hear tonight will contain a little bit of enchantment and magic. And at the end of this month, the book will be available to pre-order. So these little stories are intended as a little kind of lead up, a little taster, a little starter, if you will, to get our appetite for foodie folklore going. So in this, as I said, our final Kitchen Witch reading before the book becomes available for you to read these stories yourself. In this, our final Kitchen Witch reading, we are working, or journeying perhaps with is a better word, we're journeying with stories of the fairies, the Fae Folk, the good neighbours. And we'll look a little about the term fairy tale itself, a story of a few fairy witches, the tale of a fairy queen, fairy circles, a few tales about mushrooms, and finally a tale of a festive seasonal sprite, the Swedish tomte. But first, as it's in the title of the book, let's talk a little about fairy tales and how they differ from folk tales. If you see me pausing, it's usually because I'm letting somebody in from the waiting room, and apparently I can't multitask. So fairy tales. Fairy tales are part of folklore, but they tend to be a little more fantastical with their ideas around people. Often they feature fairies, but not always, and animals or objects that have magical powers. In contrast, folk tales are more based around traditional beliefs and practices of a culture that are passed down through stories. Both fairy tales and folk tales can be instructive, and they might leave a reader with a lesson or a warning. And it's their deeper meanings that ultimately bring about the longevity of these tales, as these lessons learned from shared stories are passed among cultures and generations. Folk tales can derive in part from real life phenomena, from the seemingly magical, like will-o'-the-wisps and fairy circles of mushrooms, to the terrifying, from illnesses to crops failing to storms at sea. Fairy tales are usually not completely literal in their plots and messages, unlike folklore, which at various points people tend to hold some truth with. They hold some truth and some belief. So folk tales and legends we tend to think of in part as being true, whereas most of us acknowledge that fairy tales are not intended to be true tales. However, there's this quote, I know it from Albert Camus, and I know Neil Gaiman said something very similar, which is that fiction is the lie through which we can tell the truth. So fairy tales are a fiction, and we know them to be that, but we also know that within them lies truth. For example, what one might do in cases of extreme fear or hunger. Others in the world of fairy tales make very little logical sense, but still they have endured, perhaps because they entertain or even invoke fear. And maybe life is every bit as strange and wonderful and unbelievable sometimes as fairy tales. So there's always a little wisdom within them, and sometimes a little truth as well. I'd like to take a little sidestep here to tell you about the word fairy tale. So in 1697, a woman called Mary Catherine d'Aulnoy, or Baroness d'Aulnoy, she wrote a book called Le Conte de Fées. She published it in Paris, and Le Conte de Fées in French means fairy tales. And when she published this book in 1697, she coined the term fairy tale. So she created this word and this term. And she also popularized some very well-known stories and themes, such as coaches made of pumpkins, which we still recognize today. So I wanted to share her name here. Within the Kitchen Witch book, I share the names of the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, and I wanted to bring in some of the women's names that also made some very notable contributions to fairy tales, not least the creation of the name fairy tale. So let's come to fairy witches. Now, during the history of the witch trials throughout Europe, people, especially in the west of England and Scotland, were sometimes accused of communications with fairies. And this was a sure sign that they were connected in some way to the world of the supernatural and the other world. So these stories of fairy witches are drawn from real accounts and real people. So, for example, John Walsh, a cunning man from Dorset in 1566, said that fairies helped him with his healing work. In Cornwall, Anne Jeffreys in 1640 reported that she was visited by fairies and they gave her the ability to cure the sick and gifted her with the skill of clairvoyance. Now, the interesting thing about the story of Anne Jeffreys is interesting and slightly horrifying, I should say. She was never accused formally of being a witch, but she was kept in Bodmin jail, and she was kept there for 3 months. And apparently she wasn't fed or offered any water during those whole 3 months that she was there, but magically she survived. And according to Anne, it was the fairies that helped her survive. They brought her food and water. So whether we think that story is true or not, something helped her survive those 3 awful months in a cold, damp prison. We hear these stories about witches, fairies, and cunning folk, and they kind of all get woven together in stories of history and folklore. It's common when it comes to beliefs of fairies and magical forces and witches that we'll see throughout books and stories and histories. There's this blending together of fairy folk and witches in ideas, for example, of malevolent acts that it might carry out, such as souring milk or stealing milk, and their attributes such as flight and shape shifting. Because in the eyes of many, pagan customs, folklore, fairy folk, witches, all kind of intermingled into this unseen place of otherness. So they would kind of weave them together within their stories, their superstitions, and their fears. But let's move now to a fairy tale. It's one that features fairies and some food, and if I'm honest, one of my favorite drinks as well. It is called The Fairy Queen's Wisdom. There was a fairy queen who lived under a hill at Ardbeg, which is a place in Scotland. Knowing that life could be difficult for the women of the Scottish Islands, she sent out invitations by the winds and with the help of the fish and the birds. They carried these invitations far and wide, and they were invitations for all women to join the fairy queen, so that she may share her wisdom with them. For, like Ceridwen and her cauldron, in the world of fairies, it is the women who hold the cup from which wisdom is dispensed. Some women were intrigued when they received their invitations, others wary, but many arrived on a bright and breezy day to the Scottish island of Islay. And the harbour was filled with boats, sails of every colour. And as the women approached the hill at Ardbeg, a great door opened, and they were warmly welcomed inside. The Fairy Queen's Hall was resplendent with tapestries of finest weaving, exquisite colours extracted from plants, purples of every shade, darkest hues of blackberries, reds, oranges from rowan, and rich red from raspberries. But the most beautiful shades were those of green. The brightest, lightest greens drawn from the youngest shoots of spring, and the deepest, darkest hues of winter holly. There were lights, candles burned, and jars held merrily dancing fireflies. Crystal chandeliers and glowing lamps lit the hall. Prisms caught beams of sunlight from skylights and cast rainbow colours upon the floor. A fabulous banquet was laid out on platters of carved slate, goblets of turned wood, and bowls of mother-of-pearl shell, and delicate glasses with curved bases, shaped like the Glen cairns built on the highest mountain peaks to honour Scottish warriors. The Fairy Queen made a grand entrance. Some say that fairies were once goddesses, and the Queen looked like a regal earth goddess in her gown of every shade from the island, greens, browns, stony greys, and ocean blues. She invited the party of women to sit, and as the fairies served them a sumptuous feast, the Queen invited the women to ask as many questions as they wished, and they all chatted merrily together. After a delicious course of honeyed oatcakes and blueberries, the Fairy Queen rose and clapped her hands for silence. She told the women that her true reason for inviting them here was that she wished that they may leave with more answers than questions. And she wished to pass on the knowledge of the fairy folk to their daughters and granddaughters. And she also wanted the women to pass on the wise words to all those too fearful to visit that day. And so the Fairy Queen lifted a great golden flagon from the table, telling the women that this vessel held the precious golden liquid that was the distilled wisdom of the world, acquired over countless generations of fairy women and guarded by the Fairy Queen herself. The flagon was large, and when passed around, each woman filled their delicate curved glasses with the golden liquid. There was plenty to go round. The Queen raised her glass and made a toast in her fairy tongue, and all the women raised their glasses and drank. The liquid had a fiery touch and a warmth that trickled through their hearts and bellies. They felt a warm glow radiate through them. A calm and a confidence permeated their bodies, hearts, and minds. And there was silence. There were no more questions. for all questions had been answered. Whiskey Betha, the water of life, had told them all the secrets of life and knowledge of the fairies. And after warm farewells and thanks to their hostess, the women prepared to leave this beautiful feast and return home. When they came out into the sunshine, they were illuminated with light from within and above. And they sought to spread the gift of wisdom from the whiskey flagon of the Fairy Queen. So that is the story of the wisdom of the Fairy Queen, one of my personal favourites. So we'll move now to a little forest folklore of witches and fairies. It is said that fairies like to make circles with mushrooms, but should you look upon a circle of mushrooms in the wild, they will disappear as soon as you see them. And certainly circles of mushroom and fungus can pop up overnight. Certain mushrooms grow in circular formations, which is a naturally occurring phenomenon of underground networks of fibres. But folklore across Europe suggests that fairy rings are the dwelling place of fairies, elves, witches, and many other magical beings. Tiny realms where the spirits dance and play. But woe betide any human who may interrupt the fun. In some English and Celtic tales, if you should enter a fairy ring, you will be compelled to dance with the fairies until you go mad or collapse. We can often see the connections and superstitions applied to foods by the common or folk names that they are given. And mushrooms are particularly blessed in their names. Even just from the UK and European species, we have witch's butter, fairy ring champignons, witch's hats, elf cups, angel's wings, and the destroying angel. Now, some of these mushrooms you can happily put into a stew, like the fairy ring champignon. Some, however, will kill you. That is the destroying angel and angel wings. And a few will have you seeing fairies and other mythical creatures in no time as you hallucinate. That would be the witch's hat. But I will note here that there are many species of mushrooms that have the nickname witch's hat, so please don't go out trying to seek hallucinogenic mushrooms. Some species of mushrooms even glow in the dark, which adds to their magical allure. Some of the oldest recorded documentation of bioluminescence in fungi was recorded by Aristotle, and he named the phenomenon foxfire. So as we're coming up to December and Yuletide, I wanted to finish with a little story about a Swedish sprite known as the tomte. So at Christmas time, Swedish children might leave out a bowl of rice pudding, flavoured with cinnamon and sugar, butter and cream. They might leave this bowl at the front door for the tomte elves to eat as thanks for their work through the year. The tomte is pictured often as a small gnome or elf who occupies a homestead and helps its inhabitants. In England, we might call them hobs or hobgoblins. In Cornwall, we might call them piskies. And if the bowl is found empty the next morning, it is a sign that the year ahead will be prosperous because the tomte has been appeased. Tomte feature in Swedish, Norse, and Finnish folklore with various spellings. They are domestic sprites responsible for the protection and welfare of buildings and their inhabitants. They're often associated with Yuletide, perhaps perhaps because the tomte is often depicted as a very strong, elderly, bearded man, often wearing a red cap. But also because he often helps out at Christmas time, preparing the home for Christmas. He seems to watch over the home in a way that the kitchen witch Poppet would very much admire. Believed by some to be the soul of the farm's first owner, who becomes the spirit figure to watch over the homestead. And tomte translates literally as homestead man, so a household spirit of sorts. Tomte are valuable guardians, but payment is always needed, and one must respect the tomte. So you must treat your farm and home and animals well, and at Yuletide offer food as thanks for their protection throughout the year. And a sure way to incur the anger of a tomte is rudeness and untidiness. And if you were to ever spill anything on your kitchen floor, it is polite to shout out a warning to the tomte lest he fall into the puddle. So that actually brings us to the end of that little collection of stories around Fae Folk and fairies. How quickly these half hours seem to go. But just before I finish, I just wanted to read you a little part of the summary of the Kitchen Witch book, just to speak to a little of why I am so excited about sharing ideas of the Kitchen Witch, folklore, and the magic of food. And it's a little summary here. Some things don't change. And maybe that's why food can be so comforting. In an ever-changing world, a hot drink will always be warming to body and soul. A meal with friends will always be comforting. Eating your family's favorite foods will always remind you of them. And when you are hungry and tired, supper waiting for you when you get home will always be a treat. But some things do change. We have seen over centuries that faith in magic has waned. We have watched through history the gradual transformation of gods into devils, of wise women into witches, and of ritual and worship into superstitious customs. And pagan festivals and customs transformed into Christian ones. But fear not. If you look, magic is still here. Goddesses and witches hide as saints, and the names of deities have found hiding places in months and years, names of our food, plants, and spices. Goddesses Artemis, Iris, and Hebe still live in our world and in our gardens. The law of the land is kept alive in the whispers of grasses in the wind. To some, ragwort is still called the fairies' horse, along with elf grass and fairy flax and witches' thimbles. Scraps of magical and pagan practices are still running through the seams of our language, customs, and history, not least through our stories. And so sharing them is essential in keeping alive ideas which could be lost. So I thank you so much for joining me and allowing me to play a part in keeping these stories alive. It is always an honor to share them and read a few tales to you. We have just a few minutes left, which is just enough time for me to say thank you so much for joining me and for sharing these words. They are all drawn from my upcoming book, Kitchen Witch, Food, Folklore and Fairy Tale. The book will be available to pre-order at the end of this month, so just 2 weeks to go, and the details will be all over my website and my social media. I will make sure that I have spread out the links and the details far and wide, but if you do have any questions, you can always email me to ask. And our journey together these lovely 3 sessions is coming to an end. Thank you so much if you joined me for all 3, or if you're joining me just for this one. It's been a real joy to share the stories with you. I am very excited about the book and about sharing the stories. So it's been really lovely to be able to share that excitement with you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to scroll through. Lots of lovely thank yous. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. And so I will send you my love. Mwah. May you have a magical rest of your day, and may the fairies treat you kindly.